Seminar series back this year, this calendar year. We are having a talk by Dr. Kate Gilchrist. She's a lecturer here at the University of Lincoln in our department, lecturer in gender studies, and she's also a lecturer at UCL, in the Department of Culture, Communications and Media. And the title of her talk today is It's Not Who I Want to Be, Negotiating the Illegible Single Woman in US, UK popular culture. So the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation. There will be some time for questions at the very end. The floor is yours, Kate.
Yes, there will definitely be some time, so I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much for the introduction. Is this okay if I stand here? Can everyone hear me okay? Do you want me to hold this?
If you want, we can leave it there near the table because it's you are within the range of the market.
Great. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming, and for those of you who have joined online. I have been at the department actually since September, but finally managed to come and present. So it's great that that I'm here today and can show you some of my research. This paper is actually based on findings from my PhD, which I completed in 2021 at LSE, and they have been published in the European Journal of Cultural Studies. So if we want to move to the first slide. So as I say, the study is drawn from a wider one. My PhD was looking at feminine subjectivity and how that is constructed through ideas around intimate life, intimate relationship formations, and singledom. So the study, the PhD as a whole, looked at both media representation of single women and at women's subjective experiences. So most research into single femininity looks at either the representation or interviews women about their lived experience, about their identity. So I tried to draw the two spheres together. I interviewed 25 women living in London, and I analysed 8 texts from the US, the UK and European films, television shows, adverts and women's magazines. So this particular paper just selects 3 of those texts and a couple of those interviews, of course for brevity. But essentially I was interested in, to cite, to quote Orgad here, how intimate personal lives are actually conditioned by and may rework the wider cultural stories that we see within media. And yes, as I say, it's published, these findings are published in the European Journal of Cultural Studies. So let's move to the next slide. So just to outline my theoretical framework, I drew on post-feminist theory, which has argued that in analysis of popular culture, that the single woman has recently been reinvigorated as a character through highly post-feminist discourses of agency, freedom, self-surveillance, and self-accountability. And I was also interested in gender subjectivity. So I draw on Judith Butler's understanding of subjectivity as being discursively constructed through and by, from a psychosocial perspective, the conjoining of the cultural, the social, and the individual as a process of essentially an interiorization of the regulatory force of social gender norms. And I also, in this paper, specifically draw again on Butler's idea of the heterosexual matrix as producing the gendered subject. So Butler sees this as an exclusionary process which requires the simultaneous production of a domain of the abject, those who are not quite subjects are not yet subjects, but who form constitutive outside to the domain of the subject. So I argue in this paper that single women or single femininity at times is positioned within this abject or liminal space between what is the norm of feminine subjectivity. And finally, I draw on ideas of identification, or specifically disidentification. And I use Munoz, I never know how to pronounce that, sorry. So his study actually looked at a different context, so queer sexualities in Latin America. So I've used this in a much different context, but he argued that minority sexuality subject positions are formed through processes of disidentification with dominant identity structures. So rather than fully opposing them, often individuals actually tactically work on, within, and against the more dominant cultural forms, such as normative sexuality and gender roles. So I'm going to show how I felt this process was occurring, how single women themselves were doing this with normative ideas around femininity. Next slide. So just to move on to my methodology, I drew upon, well, the wider study included some European texts as well, but they were largely US and UK. And I argue that really US and UK popular culture has a very strong discursive harmony. And equally as interested in, well, I argue that popular culture is highly post-feminist. And Taylor, in her study of Single Women, has claimed, and I build on this claim, that post-feminism is a broad discursive system which requires analysis across a range of sites throughout media. So my selection includes multiple genres. And so while I span different genres across television, film, advertising, women's magazines, I argue that each of them were chosen because they feature key post-feminist and historical themes of single femininity, which I found when I did a historical analysis of literature as part of the background, and then I examined my contemporary text. So they were chosen based on the fact that these themes were repeated across these different sites. And as Chularaki argues, this indicates significance where you see this repetition, discursive repetition across sites. So then to move on to the interviews, as well as I mentioned, I did 25 semi-structured one-hour interviews with women living in London. Being single is a complex and contested category that can be defined in different ways. But because I was interested in how women were understanding their own identity and subjectivity, I asked them just to self-identify as being single, so those who felt that they were, and self-identified as female. I tried to include as much diversity within my sample with mixed results, but I ended up with quite a wide range of ages, from 21 to 66. But the majority, the mean was 37. Racially, predominantly white, 76%, 24% from Black, Asian, or ethnic minority. Class as well, predominantly middle class in the end, despite trying to get more diversity there. And again, predominantly straight, with 18%, lesbian, bisexual, or queer, and all were cisgender. So, to then just quickly move to the analysis, how I conducted it. So I first of all conducted a thematic analysis on both the interview data separately from the media text and a Foucauldian discourse analysis. And I wanted to see, using the Foucauldian analysis, how certain single subject positions were legitimised or not, and how these subject positions challenged or sustained gendered hierarchies of power. And finally, this came up quite a lot, what positions were left unsaid, or rendered unspeakable, I argued. So where were their silences? Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight as well, from often media, it's an audience study is the usual approach, and I didn't do an audience study here. So I didn't ask the women that I interviewed specifically about these texts that I analysed. Sometimes they came up, but that was not really my intention. I wanted to do an in-depth analysis of the key texts selected according to the criteria, and then I wanted to see where there was resonances within the women's accounts or not. Where were their contrasts? Where were their gaps? Where did they converge? where did they diverge? Or perhaps did the lived experience accounts take up similar themes that I found in the media and perhaps shift or reverse them? I drew the two sets of data together using the conceptual lens of fantasy. So I mentioned that I took a psychosocial understanding of subjectivity. So this lends itself to also considering psychoanalysis as a concept. So Diana Fuss is a film theorist who considers fantasy as being integral to the process of identification of media texts. So in her film analysis, she argues that fantasy is actually a process of identification, where we watch what's on screen and we either desire to become the other who we see on the screen or not. And that's quite key in this analysis as well. So where do people not identify? Just to very much simplify her theorization. So based on all of that, my research question was, how are fantasies of single femininity constructed in representations, and how are single women discursively negotiating or resisting these fantasies? And summarizing, first of all, just briefly summarizing findings, and then I'll go into more detail. So, I don't know how I'm doing in time. Okay. Women were found in my sample to both identify and disidentify with cultural tropes of single femininity, to reflexively construct their single subject positions against the coupled feminine norm. But again, drawing on Mana's, women also tactically work with and against non-normative single identities, including queer sexualities, to self-reflexively construct what I argue are alternative single subjectivities. Just to add that this specific piece of research that I'm presenting here doesn't include so much the use of queer sexualities, but that is in my wider paper that I can share if you're interested. So I've just picked out some aspects of it. So if we move to the next slide. So the first set of findings were in relation to this idea of incoherence and instability. So as I mentioned, I draw on Judith Butler's understanding of the heterosexual matrix and the fact that gender subjects are produced through the establishment of the illegible, so who is outside subjectivity. So to quote here, the production of the insymbolizable, the unspeakable, the illegible is always a strategy of abjection. And I find that single femininity was often produced as being illegible, so as essentially a process of objectification. So the viable feminine subject is heterosexually coupled and is sustained through this exclusionary objectification of single femininity and through processes of illegibility, incoherence, and instability. So just to take one example here of from the film Frances Ha. This is one of the less mainstream films I looked at by Noah Baumbach. Less popular, but was still critically acclaimed. So the film was about this key character Frances, who was single, and she was subject to a destabilizing, a slight troubling of her femininity through processes of masculinization. So she was often engaged in very masculinized behaviors, such as play fighting, trying to fight with her friends, shouting, getting very drunk, swearing, engaging in kind of small criminal acts, publicly urinating on the tracks of the train, was called too tall to marry frequently, and having a weird man walk. And humor was obviously used in this, but this process she was called undateable. So this is just one small example, and then the next slide. And then again, in a second film that I analysed, which was much more mainstream and made a huge amount of money at the box office, How to Be Single. I don't know if any of you recognise that. But again, I think the key character, Alice, was produced as being very incoherent as a subject. She often talked about the risk of herself disappearing if she didn't continually engage in very active, intensive, effective self-regulation. So throughout the film, we see her trying to find herself post-breakup. And in this quote here, she bumps into her ex-boyfriend who she's trying to get over throughout the entire film. And she says, "I spent so much time wanting you back that when I thought that you wanted me back, it's like I lost my mind for a second. I completely lose myself. I forget what I want and I just disappear." So this kind of idea of the single subject as constantly at risk of disappearing, of being absent, of being missing, of being invisible was consistent throughout many of the texts. So that's the final slide from the first part of my finding, incoherence and destability. So I'd argue that from the same film, there was a secondary character played by Rebel Wilson, Robin. And she was very much contrasted to the main character, Alice. And I argue that she's emblematic of what Gillian Rowe has written about in her media analysis of the unruly woman. So Rowe defines unruly women as being excessive, again this theme of androgyny, masculinized, associated with extremes, negative extremes such as whorishness, dirt, and liminality, breaking the rules of feminine divine composure as a way of yet pushing her to the boundaries of what is acceptable feminine behavior. And we saw this with Robin. We frequently saw, even in her movements, her bodily comportment, she strides through the streets in a very confident way. She tumbles around, she rolls out of taxis and beds, clambers from behind sofas. She engaged in violence, a bit more extreme, I'd say, than Frances. So she wields a knife at someone that when she wakes up, forgetting where she is, and she repeatedly punches Alice, her friend. She's shown, again, risky behaviour, promiscuity, excessive drinking, swearing, and really sexualized behaviour and speech. And contamination, she is shown taking drugs. Again, we see the theme of public urination. But Robin, in contrast, I would say, is actually shown in a much more hedonistic and pleasurable rather than deviant way. So troubles this idea of femininity, but in a way that she's not so much policed as the previous character that we looked at. But I think that that's partly because she is placed in relational juxtaposition to Alice as being the more normative single female in this film, and highlights Alice as being a very self-composed character, very self-regulating, and exposes her as being even more liminal through that process. So yes, so moving on to the second kind of broad set of findings, which was concerned with identification. So how did the women that I interviewed identify with not just the media texts, well, not the media text that I looked at specifically, but media text more broadly. Again, drawing on Butler's understanding of how gender subjects are formed. Butler argues that we each of us have a phantasmic desire for coherence, for coherent identification or stable gender identity. And this is foundational to how gender is constructed. Impossible, but foundational. So I asked my interviews right at the beginning if they could think of a single woman, not even that they identified with, just think of a single woman, either fictional or real. And maybe they just felt under the spot, but so many of my interviewees were stumped and really, really concerned that they couldn't think of anyone. No one came to mind. They said, yes, I'm sure, but then when trying to come up with an example, failed. And I argued that this is partly due to the fact that the single woman is either absent or incoherent. Some of them, they weren't happy about this. They showed some distress. Some of them instead drew upon examples of coupled women and said, well, actually, I still identify in this way, even as a single woman, with this character, with this person who happens to be coupled, but this means something to me. So, for example, Annette here. Annette was a white, 30-year-old heterosexual middle-class woman who I interviewed, and she told me quite passionately how she really liked the character of Wynonna Earp in, I think it's a Netflix series, played by Melanie Scrofano. And she explained in detail why. Why was this important to her? Why did she see connections between this character? And she talks about, so there's a whole fight scene in one of the episodes where it's like 3 women fighting. A lot of superhero women are flat personalities, whereas the main character is like a total hot mess. She's got like massive trauma from her childhood, like an emotional roller coaster. It's like, okay, you're a real person. I can identify with that. So if we move to the next slide, I've got the analysis of this. So coming back to Menez, this idea that rather than fully opposing the norm, individuals tactically work on, within, and against that, particularly normative sexual gender roles. So I argue that Annette values Wynonna not specifically for her coupling, but for her realistic portrayal, which incorporates both physical strength and vulnerability. So I argue that she seeks to transform the normative coupled woman by working from within, so within the coupled norm, drawing on aspirational elements for her own purposes of identification and trying to revalue them. So, but not only does perhaps this identification still reinscribe the coupled norm, the coupled femininity, it partially, interestingly, situes Annette's single femininity to what I find was historical tropes of single femininity, of violence and mental instability, you know, being a hot mess, but perhaps does so in more positive ways. So she tries to value and valorize these. So if we move to the next slide. Thank you. So finally, coming on to this idea that there was also disidentifications with media texts and cultural ideas around single femininity. So Erin was a 47-year-old white heterosexual middle-class woman who I spoke to. And so again, going back to Butler, this idea that abjectification is also, it's a subconscious process of both identification and at times disavowal. So abjectification takes place both through identification with that abjection and a process of identification which has to be disavowed. So I thought this was really well summed up by her. She was discussing the figure of Jennifer Aniston, who is one prominent, frequently constructed as single celebrity figure. And she talks about, she says, I was reading about Jennifer Aniston, and I think she's always painted as a slightly tragic figure. And to my horror, I find myself thinking, oh, that's so sad. And then I think, that's me. And I'd be outraged if someone was describing me in the way that she's being described, as lacking and as having lost in some way. I thought this was really, really important. So I felt that Erin was, in that statement, ambivalently kind of caught between this pitying and a very also shocking realization that she sees herself within this representation. And then she tries to reject that. She tries to reassert herself and say, well, no, I would never position myself in that way. And if someone did that to me, that would be something that I would resist. So she kind of agentically constructs, again, an alternative single subjectivity, one which is more positively valued and isn't seen as characterized through loss in the same way that Jennifer is. So really distances herself from that. So finally, this is the quote from the title of this paper. And this was a much more direct disavowal. So again, Butler says, identifications are made in order to sometimes institute disidentification with a position that you cannot really embrace, you cannot allow yourself, because it's too saturated with injury and aggression. And if you actually allowed yourself to identify with it, it would be imagining the loss of your identity altogether. So Helen was a 41-year-old white heterosexual middle-class woman that I spoke to, and she got quite upset when she was talking about who she saw in the media who was single. And she, at my question almost, and really kind of visibly almost angry. And she said, no, I don't go around looking at single women going, that's who I want to be, because it's not who I want to be. So I'm like, that's nice, you go do your single thing. And actually, what can I learn from these women who have what I feel like I want? And I've got Oprah here, she talked about the fact that she doesn't want to be like Oprah. Poor Oprah is not married, that's not who she aspires to be. So she explicitly attempts to resist identification, and of course is re-establishes in this the boundary of the viable, desirable feminine subject as definitely coupled. But I think the anger that she expressed shows that actually within that there is some pain there that this unwanted identification produces within her, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Of course, you know, she doesn't have to identify in this way, but yeah, it was a really important part of my interview. I don't know how much time we've got left. Is that?
Yeah, you have 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, so just to that, I covered it. I felt a lot in those slides, but just to kind of sum up my conclusions more broadly from the wider paper. So overall, I argue that women were caught between this phantasmic desire for having a legible, coherent single femininity and a desire to disidentify, even if partially, with an objectified positioning, which often both the media analysis found and they discussed themselves. In the absence of more coherent representations of single femininity, they drew on non-single women in ways which still worked within the coupled norm. Where they did encounter objectifying cultural representations, they attempted at times to resist these painful associations. But overall, I said they were often very ambivalent encounters, where they really struggled and agentically managed and sought to revalue single femininity as being desirable, while also at times, again, tactically recentered couple femininity to try and affirm themselves, their own status, their own identity, as being a viable subject as a single woman. So that's, yeah.
Thank you very much.
A little bit early, but I look forward to, any
excellent, very, very, very thought-provoking, actually. I'm sure we're going to have some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes, Mike.
Thanks for that. And congrats on getting something published from it so soon, because it took me a while. But yeah, I have one question, which is, so in one of the films, which I haven't seen, so apologies that I don't exactly know the context, but you're talking about that encounter with the ex and as being, well, yeah, I feel like I'm losing myself, like just in this encounter, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this idea that in some ways the self is being lost to the coupling or the prospect of doing it. Is that a theme that you saw in your interviewees as well come through?
Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, thinking there was one person directly talked about feeling that almost exactly the same from the film, that they had lost themselves while coupled, and being single was a process of finding themselves again, finding their true self. And they constructed that in a very, very positive way, more positive than we saw with Alice in the film. But very much linking to post-feminist themes of femininity as being a process of self-surveillance and self-regulation, and Foucauldian idea of these technologies of the self, that the self is something to be cultivated and discovered, but yeah, in a very particular way that's actually quite restrictive. But yes, I did find that come up almost exactly in the same way as, but framed more positively, I would say.
Yeah, almost
by
like
the women.
the singlehood experience has to have a specific function in relation to the development of the self.
Yes, and with a goal towards, once you have found your true unifying self, that then will allow you, we saw this with Alice in the film, to be ready to couple. So the goal is always singledom as being a process to allow you to be fit for coupledom as the end goal. There's never a happily ever after that's still single. It's always the end goal is to produce you as a better subject who's ready for coupling, to live happily ever after. And that's something that came up in the interviews as well. There's no vision of to cite Ahmed, the good life, that shows someone being single really often.
Thank you.
Right. Any more questions?
Thank you for the question.
I have a few. Just have a few questions.
Yeah.
The one thing you talked about identification and the fact that some of your interviewees resisted or challenged or worked with or struggled with the images that they saw. But what about their approach, not only regarding how they see themselves through those images, but how they see others, look at them, others who are going to watch these films, like heteronormously identifying themselves as problematic or deviant or extraordinary or temporary or transitional or unlucky. Sometimes in talking about other groups as well, like LGBTQ people being caricatured as clownish, particularly in films in the 80s and 70s. They knew who they were, but they were very much concerned about the public image because the family is going to watch those comedy shows and they will say, don't become like that, don't become the clown of the show. So what about that kind of identification, heteronomous identification, how others will see me and feel about me?
Yes, that is another section of the research that came out in the interviews. Very much sometimes they would say, well, I have this understanding of myself as a single subject and I'm happy with that, but I'm constantly being positioned by my family and my friends in ways I'm not happy. I've got a paper actually about where I argue that silences and silencing were key. So they would say to me, well, I'm really lucky because my family never mentioned that I'm single. It's not brought up, and that's wonderful because I know of other people, they're single and people make comments. And so of course it's like, why must it never be spoken about? And then I asked them more about what those silences did, and they said they felt deep shame, and those were the times where I had a few of my interviewees broke down crying, and it was often in relationship to their mothers or close family members, that it was unspeakable. They could speak about everything else but not their single status, and that was a source of deep shame and distress for most of them. But again, when you come to trying to analyze in media absence, silence, and lack, it's much harder. So that came through a lot more strongly when they discussed their relationships with other people.
But feel free to raise your hand. I will see you. But following up on this, yes, I'll go. No, you priorities of the audience.
No, if you want to follow up, Harris, it's fine.
You could go ahead. Don't worry.
Thanks a lot, Kate. Really interesting presentation. Forgive me if you may have referred to this, but did you see any difference with your interviewees across? So you had a level of diversity in terms of your interviewees, but in terms of responses, did you see any particular difference in terms of particularly, say, age or class and so on, in terms of the that kind of self-identification and so on? Any kind of noticeable things that jumped out?
Yeah, that's a good question. Overall, and I did a lot of interviews, but I do get that question quite a bit. Overall, less difference than you might imagine, but with age, for example, I've been asked before, well, presumably the youngest women that you spoke to would have felt less of a sense that they have to be coupled. Not the case. I had a 21-year-old who said that their family were putting extreme pressure on them to be coupled, and why don't they have a boyfriend yet? But there was one of my older interviewees, or the older interviewees were more likely, a couple of them, to have. So I asked them, what did they see? What did they see as their future? To have a more positive. They've developed their own understanding of what their future would look like, and it was more positive. Whereas most of my other interviewees kind of said, well, really, in the future, I do want to end up with someone. So the older interviewees had started to. One of the ones that I cited here, Erin, one of the interviewees, had said, oh yeah, I'm over that now. I don't see myself really as, I'm past the age of having children, and I now have envisaged a different future that isn't going to be coupled. Another talked about moving abroad and enjoying their freedom. So yeah, I think the sense of like having developed a more positive future, I saw in a couple of the older people, but overall it's pretty consistent. And then in terms of class, I think probably unsurprisingly, I mentioned that my sample was largely middle class, and there was a difference with the working class women that I spoke to. The middle class women, again, it was very post-feminist. They talked about, well, one of the key wonderful aspects of being single is that I can choose what to do with my leisure. I can go on holiday, I can wherever I want. I don't need to take anyone else. I can do this, I can do it. They talked about decorating their houses in a particular way that they liked. The freedom as an agentic subject. The working class women, of course, were much more highlighted the fact that, well, I watch adverts on TV, and there might be a single person, but they're doing things that I can't afford to do, and actually I am much more restricted in what I can do with my life because I'm paying the rent myself, or I'm paying, the bills myself, and they saw it as a much more negative, financially restrictive status to have. And of course, yeah, financially, single people are penalised. There's been a lot in the cost of living crisis about that. So yeah, that was probably the other key difference. And I wish I'd had more working class interviewees.
Did you find any difference with the media representation as well? That maybe, say, some of the films and so on that maybe, say, targeted at those in their 20s and so on, compared to and that may have been an age difference in terms of some of the examples you've given, sort of role models, coupled or non-coupled role models, and so on may have been different to different generations.
Yes, the media representations were very much younger, almost across the board, unsurprisingly. So, yeah, older single femininity, apart from, of course, Jennifer Aniston is a good example, but yeah, young and again, wealthy middle class with a lot of money to spend.
You didn't mention parents, whether any of them were single parents, and I was curious to know whether that was the case and whether that had any impact on bringing their self-identification, because I think then you identify as something, it becomes subsumed in being a parent, perhaps. I also had a slightly kind of cheeky question, but it occurred to me the question about whether people can name any single women or prominent single women, and I'm not sure I can, but I'm not sure I know whether they're. I don't know if people are married or not. Do people know if other people are married or people in the public eye? Do I just not read the right?
The right magazine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess I mean a representation that highlights them as being
Right.
single.
Okay.
Yeah. They did sometimes come up with examples, yes. Oh, I've just come back to your question. I didn't mention the exclusions, so I didn't interview people who were single parents because, or mothers, because there's a whole range of literature around how feminine identity is so shaped by motherhood. But they talked about not being mothers sometimes. Yeah, about that being painful. Yes.
I was just sort of formulating this in my head as a question. I'm not sure it's a question. I'm thinking about Arish's point about transitions and the comment over here, I don't know, sorry, about ages. We might think of the 21-year-old and 66-year-old as being pre or post relationship rather than single. And Andrew's comment about families. Do you distinguish between somebody who is single in the sense of not in a relationship but has a full household and a busy full family and social life versus somebody who is single in the literal sense of doing life alone? Because it seems that a lot of these negative portrayals are about women being adrift, women who are sold, who are alone, rather than women who are between boyfriends but otherwise very busy and loved and loving.
What did I distinguish in the?
Do you distinguish between different kinds of singleness? I wonder if, I know it's unkindly, I wonder if there's a bit of a dodge at the start by letting the interviewees define singleness for themselves. I think there's quite a lot that could be unpacked there as to what we're really talking about. Is it being between relationships? Is it being alone? Is it about love and lovelessness,
Yeah. Yeah, of course there is a whole huge other area within the literature around the different kinds of singledom that there are. And there are some studies that look at specifically at people who have never been married as a way of trying to categorize that. But it is really hard to group people in that way. My approach was just to try and be as diverse as possible and to see whether all of these different understandings came out to those who saw themselves as more positively I'm choosing an independent life. And yeah, you're right, there were some people did see themselves as simply just being in between relationships, as having had relationships, but the majority that came forward hadn't had actually any real relationship or the one that they saw as being significant or real, and that's maybe partly in their self-sampling, who comes forward for a study like that. And I did seem to get people who were more lifelong singles, never married, didn't see themselves as just in between relationships. But that's a really good question. And initially I wanted to just confine. I wanted to define that as just anyone who is not in the coupled norm, how it's defined in the literature of a long-term monogamous partnership of two people. But my supervisor said that was too broad. So.
Right, we have 5 more minutes if you have any questions. Adele?
Yeah, thanks very much. I found that fascinating, and also that it was interesting when you said you'd asked that question and people found it difficult to respond, because I sat here for ages thinking, who can I think of? I eventually, in my first thoughts were of people who fictionally started off single but stopped being single partway through. Even some nuns who started off single and ended up, and I ended up with Miss Marple. And also, I don't know if it's a film you looked at, but I think it's quite an interesting portrayal of a single woman who's Dead Man Walking with Susan Sarandon. She's a nun who talks very positively about still having a very fulfilled life full of love, a different kind of love. But I wondered if any of the women in your sample were of a particular religion, or especially actually evangelical Christianity, because there's,
Yeah.
well, I guess this would be the case perhaps for other religions as well, but there can be pressure on, particularly on young people within the faith to marry within the faith, or at least marry someone who identifies as a Christian, and it means that, and there are more Christian women than men, so it means there are quite a few women who perhaps would not want to be single, but they might describe themselves as the phrase they might use is cool to be single. Some people describe themselves as cool to be single because the Apostle Paul described himself as cool to be single, and I wonder if that was a trope you'd come across at all in your
Cool to be single.
Called,
Yeah.
like a call from God to be single, either temporarily or permanently.
One of my interviewees was from a very Christian upbringing and had talked about trying to find someone, one of the older interviewees, through the church, but didn't strongly link her single status to that expressing in the interview. And beyond that, yeah, I know religion is another really rich area. I did a historical analysis of how single women had been represented as part of the background to my PhD. And yeah, like there was a connection just to asexuality and single women in the church, and to missionaries specifically. There's quite a bit have been written about single nuns or missionaries. But yeah, beyond that, I didn't cover much around religion, but certainly that link between they're either very asexual or hypersexualized historically. Those are the two extremes. No, I haven't come across that term. Thank you.
Right. Well, just a short question because we're running out of time. It's about the films that portray finding love, getting married, or even wedding ceremonies, because I think 70% of the films are about people finding love. Do they have a stronger actual influence on on the kind of internal struggle with identity that single women might have, rather than just these caricatures that you're just preparing? Are you suspecting that by watching a lot of that, they might be even more disturbed or agitated or reacting to this, the portrayal of this is your life story. Your life story should be like that. And being single, unlike other minorities, I like being a minority, like a person of color, is something that you're supposed to change. You can change.
Yes.
Have you come across any reaction that I saw this film or Pretty Woman or whatever, and I felt awkward? Why I'm not there? Why I'm not that protagonist?
They did. A couple of my interviews did talk generally about rom-coms, I think.
Yeah.
Films focused on finding romance, and there was a bit of a split between some of them talked about enjoying watching those films, and others saying that they were actively hated them, and one of them said that one of their New Year's resolutions one year was to never watch another rom-com because it upset them so deeply. But yeah, I think there's something in the idea that we can find, and Butler argues we can find pleasure in our own subjugation, it's hard to say that word, and it's so inherently linked within femininity, all of these romance discourses, that you can still enjoy watching it while still feeling an element of discomfort. And definitely some of the women, it was like a guilty pleasure, I should say, and they kind of discounted the narratives that, well, I don't really agree or don't like that, but I still enjoy, there's still pleasure there, and because it's so inherent within our culture for women, definitely.
Sometimes it's so fake and rosy that we know it's not reality. But anyway.
But there's a reason why it's pleasurable, why it resonates, why they're so popular.
Yeah. Well, any last comments now, because we've run out of time. Thank you very much for this thoughtful presentation. Friday the 17th, Dr. Adam Formby will present his work on, responding to community voice in widening participation. So thank